back to 37th in the World, the flagship podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. I'm Sophia Klein. Today, we're joined by Greg Bertelsen, CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, a nonprofit think tank organization dedicated to advancing durable, market-based solutions to climate change. Before leading the council, Greg served as Senior Director of Energy and Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, and earlier advised major companies on carbon pricing and environmental markets. Today, we'll be discussing the evolving role of market-driven climate policy in the United States, the idea of Americans' carbon advantage, and how climate action intersects with questions of economic competitiveness, trade, and geopolitical rivalry. Let's dive in. Greg, you've been with the Climate Leadership Council since 2017 and took over as CEO in 2020. From your vantage point, how has the council's mission and the political landscape around market-based climate solutions evolved over that time?
Our mission as an organization hasn't changed at all over my time at the council since the council was founded in 2017. We continue to pursue the most effective, fair, and lasting climate solutions. That's why we are in the game. That's why we come to work every day. Our sort of philosophical strategy hasn't changed. We continue to believe to make meaningful climate progress, we need to see the United States act as a leader. And to do that, we need policies that are effective and durable. And to us, that means politically popular and bipartisan. So that is still an approach that we think is the right approach. It's still our focus and our work today. What has changed, in my estimation, since 2017 is the political landscape around climate. And certainly, I would say my perspective of the political landscape around climate. If you go back to 2017, I had a view, which I think was kind of like the conventional view among people who were focused on climate policy, which is that we were headed in a pretty steady direction in terms of public opinion on climate. Increasingly, voters were concerned about climate, decreasing number of voters who were questioning the science of man-made climate change. And if you played that trend out a few more years, there was a feeling of inevitability that we would have a serious and meaningful bipartisan discussion and ultimately bipartisan effort towards meaningfully addressing climate change. And while we got a lot right on those trend lines, like really and truly, the American public has increasingly identified climate as a concern, really and truly, the number of voters who question the science of climate change has declined. What hasn't changed is how voters, and by extension, their members of Congress, prioritize climate. And so looking back to the last presidential election, when voters were asked what their priority issues were, only 4% said climate. So of all of the issues, only 4% of voters said it was a top priority. And that's just the reality of where the public is. And I don't think I'm in a position to say that anyone's priorities is right or wrong. I think it's a mistake to try to impose one's values on someone else. But the sober reality is that's where the American public is. And so until that number increases, until we see a much larger percentage of voters prioritize climate as a top issue, I believe the right approach to progress needs to be meeting voters and by extension their members of Congress where they are, the priorities that they do identify, and find ways for good climate policy to fit in behind those other priorities. So I think it's quite possible that we could get to a place in which we're debating a major domestic market-based climate policy in the United States. But I think a prerequisite for that will have to be the American voter saying to their elected officials, hey, this is a number one issue. We want you guys to debate and find the best solution. And I think that's the case. I think that's where they'll land. But until then, we'll be exploring different approaches, which means we can still make progress. It's just sort of like what you're leading with, so to speak.
In your 2024 report, Prioritizing American Interests, you argue that the U.S. must adopt an unapologetically pro-American approach to global decarbonization, one that treats climate progress and national interest as mutually reinforcing. Can you unpack what that really means in practice and why you think this framing could finally make climate policy politically durable in the U.S.?
I think the climate community, broadly speaking, has made a strategic error in starting with a desire to impose values on others. And I think that's not unique to the climate movement. I think any area of special interest, any area of major concern, there's always an inclination to do that. I've obviously dedicated my career to working on climate, so I understand that inclination. But I think the result of it has been, the unintended result of it has been pursuing policies that end up being more symbolic in nature than meaningful in impact. So whether it's like natural gas bans or, banning plastic straws, all of which may have important environmental intentions, in doing so, they've become these sort of like political lightning rod issues, and in part has cost us a bit of trust with the American public. And at the same time, those who are adamantly opposed to climate action have used these symbolic battles to sort of drive a wedge into American voters, sort of like seed this doubt that any climate action is going to equate to some form of a loss of freedom or a loss of your ability to buy the product that you want to buy. I believe a much better and more viable approach is to start with a policy that is consistent with where the vast majority of the voting public is. Start with the priorities of most Americans, which tends to be around their economic well-being, economic opportunities for their kids, seeing their communities flourish, starting there and building good climate policy behind it. So our report, which was titled, as you noted, Prioritizing American Interests, makes the case that good U.S. climate policy should start with prioritizing interests other than climate, whether it be economic interests or geopolitical interests. And in doing so, we can find policies that have net emission reducing impacts. And in that report, what we were particularly focused on was seeing the United States play a bigger role in global markets, both on the investment side and in exporting more US products. And if designed right, we can first and foremost ensure that we're advancing the priorities of Americans on the economic side of things, while at the same time having a meaningful impact on lowering global emissions.
Paul, you engage with a wide range of industries and stakeholders, from steel and chemicals to clean tech startups to policymaker groups. How do you decide which sectors and organizations to partner with? And what qualities do you look for in collaborators who are genuinely committed to long-term climate solutions?
We, as you note, Sophia, we work with a broad range of stakeholders, companies from industries across the economy, other nonprofit organizations, labor interests, academics, and members of Congress and their staff on both sides of the aisle. And we work with folks when we find our priorities aligning. And so if you look at the businesses we work with, if we're working with a business on a particular policy or a particular climate policy, it's because that approach is going to be good for their business. And if we're working on it, it's because we've carefully studied and analyzed the policy and determined with a great deal of confidence that it's going to have a positive impact on reducing global emissions. So one area where we've spent a lot of time over the course of the last couple of years is around the intersection of climate and trade policy. About 25% of global emissions, so of all emissions that are emitted globally each year, are associated with or embodied in goods that are ultimately traded across international borders. So that's like a huge choke point in the global economy in which a lot of emissions effectively flow. And if we were able to establish a global trading regime that was rewarding lower carbon manufacturing, penalizing higher carbon manufacturing, we'd create that market incentive that we're big fans of towards lower emissions across the board. And one of the reasons that we're particularly enthusiastic about it is we've analyzed this deeply and found that US industry, kind of across the board, stands to win in this kind of a policy framework. And the reason for that is that on average, US industries are more carbon efficient, which means they make the same or similar products while emitting less carbon than most of their global competitors. And there's a host of reasons for that, which I'm happy to dive into. But as we look at this, it's an opportunity to establish a massive market incentive to encourage global decarbonization, while at the same time presenting a clear opportunity for US industries to compete and frankly win in this new paradigm. And again, this kind of gives you an example of the kind of like win for US industry and the companies we work with, win for global emissions that we're looking for and that we specialize when we're going about our work.
So, I believe it was your 2024 report as well, it also argues that China has used its Belt and Road Initiative to dominate clean energy and industrial investment in the developing world, often with carbon heavy infrastructure, and that the US needs a more aggressive strategy to effectively compete with China. So, what would a distinctly American model look like in practice? And do you think that the US can really move at the scale that China has?
I firmly believe that on an even playing field, US industry is going to win more often than not going head to head against China on an even playing field. The playing field is not level. The playing field is not level. And that's where US policy needs to step in. And so let me come back to that in a second. There's also a dynamic that is sort of a self-inflicted wound we've given ourselves when it comes to competing for the next generation of energy technologies. What China has done well over the course of the last decade or so is recognized the massive global economic opportunity that exists in clean energy technologies, and they are dominating in those markets. Now um, they have not always played fairly. They have utilized non-market tactics. They've sought actively to sort of chase away competition. But our U.S. political discourse has had a role in that too. We've spent so much time here in Washington debating like the science of climate change. We've been debating these sort of symbolic climate initiatives, and all when we really should have over the course of the last decade been focused on how can we compete and win on battery technologies and EV technologies and renewable electricity technologies. And we've lost a lot of ground. And as a result, China is significantly out exporting the US on these technologies. So that's the bad news. The good news, if you will, less so for climate, is that this is a multi-decade challenge. I mean, there's just no scenario. It's very unlikely scenarios in which we aren't working towards global decarbonization over the course of the next several decades. And that means that this is a long race. And by some estimations, about 40% of the technologies that are going to be needed to decarbonize the globe are either not invented or are not commercially viable. And so the US needs a concerted strategy to compete for that next generation of energy technology. And there's a component to making smart investments here, US at home. There's a component that includes ensuring that we have the energy and the energy infrastructure to power that manufacturing base of the next generation of energy technologies. But there's also a role for the US government to help open up markets for US businesses, for US clean energy innovators, so that they are able to compete in these international markets. And that's been a big focus of ours, is looking at the tools and the toolkit that the federal government already has to support US industry, to support US clean energy industry competing abroad. And how can we scale those tools up? How can we make them work better? How can we make agencies who are doing similar things work better together? So that's been a big focus of our work as we've been thinking about how the US can compete and win with China and others over the course of the next several decades.
So you've managed to engage senators, policymakers, people from all across the political, ideological spectrum. What's your read on how to make climate a post-partisan issue in Washington? And describe that process of engaging people with various perspectives and maybe some lessons from those conversations that might apply more broadly to climate communications or to effective communications in general.
I think what people would be surprised who don't work in Washington is just how many members on both sides of the aisle are looking for common ground. And most of the attention on national media, and fairly so, are where there is disagreement. But there are a lot of members on both sides of the aisle who are really and truly trying to solve big problems, who understand that working across the aisle is the best and most effective way to enact good and lasting change. And so our approach has always been to meet members of Congress, regardless of which political party they are associated with, meet them where they are, understand what their priorities are, what the priorities are of their constituents, the folks who elected them into office, and see where those priorities can overlap with policies that are effective at lowering global emissions. And we've had a lot of success. Using that approach in bringing both Democrats and Republicans together on similar or on the same policy.
One of the Council's flagship projects, America's Carbon Advantage, reframes climate action as a competitiveness issue. Can you describe how that idea, measuring and leveraging the US's carbon efficiency, actually translates into legislative momentum?
So one of the things that we do at the council is go deep on data. So we're sort of data nerds here at the council, and we've I guess now going back about 5 years, we were examining what the relative carbon efficiency was of US industry compared to like 60 or 70 countries around the world. So the 60 or 70 largest economies. How does US industry stack up on the basis of our carbon efficiency? How do we stack up in terms of the amount of carbon we emit to produce a ton of steel or a ton of cement or an automobile? And what we found was, in a way, a confirmation of what we suspected, which is that US industry in most sectors are more carbon efficient than most of their global competitors. And compared to countries like China or Russia or India, there's a huge, what we would describe as carbon advantage, like in the nature of like 3 or 4 times more carbon efficient than those countries. Then there are a few reasons for that. One of which is we are fortunate in that we've got a diverse set of energy sources, of course, natural gas, but also zero carbon resources like nuclear, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. So that's one reason. Another is that our industries are very efficient. And part of that is due to our market economy. There's an economic reward in our economy directly to operating more efficiently. Our industries have made investments to operate with fewer emissions. We have higher environmental standards. But all of those investments complying with environmental regulations comes with a cost. And what we've also identified, which industry is quite aware of, is that the playing field is not always level in terms of the cost being incurred in one country versus another. And if you're an industry and your product is a commodity or traded like a commodity, those additional costs to hit higher environmental standards can make a real difference in terms of your competitiveness. And so sort of putting it all together, our view is we should be establishing a policy that creates a level playing field. Carbon is an area that we have an advantage already. And if we get the playing field level and the incentives right, we're going to see US industry compete and win, frankly. And that will be a benefit, of course, to the US economy, to US communities, but so too will it be a benefit to climate. The more that global demand can be met with US production, with cleaner US production, the more global emissions stand to fall.
As you look at the next 5 years, from critical minerals to AI-driven energy demand, where do you see the next big opportunity to market-driven climate solutions that could actually move the needle globally?
So two thoughts. One, I think it's inevitable that the global economy will have some form of a climate and trade approach, some form of a economic reward system that is valuing lower carbon manufacturing, penalizing higher carbon production and manufacturing. I think that is inevitable. It's just a question of when and how the policy is developed. So I'm quite optimistic on that. And that's good because it's also very hard for me to imagine a scenario in which we meaningfully decarbonize the global economy without those kinds of levers at international borders as part of our trading system. The second point I'd share, which is similarly optimistic, frankly, is we are confronted at the moment with an enormous societal challenge and opportunity in the form of increasing energy demand, driven in part by data centers, AI, but also electrification and a number of other factors. Enormous challenge in that we need a lot more energy, we need a lot more electricity. Enormous challenge in that there's going to be emissions impacts from that increasing energy use and electricity use. But enormous opportunity because this is a cue to innovators around the world and innovators in the United States to develop and advance next generation clean energy technologies. And so I predict that coming out of this moment in which we don't know how we're going to build enough power plants, how we're going to deliver enough energy to meet what seems like it might be an never-ending demand of energy. How we're going to meet that and also meet our climate challenges. And I actually think this challenge is going to be the reason, is going to be the cause of those innovative technological breakthroughs that are ultimately going to allow us to meet the needs of humanity, meet humanity's energy needs without having an impact on climate.
Thank you for your time, Greg. We hope you all enjoyed listening. be sure to follow along with 37th in the World and all of our amazing episodes coming out. Thank you.
This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast's description that says support the show. To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out GJIA.georgetown.edu.